request before we get started, please can you put your phones on silent? We are live streaming this event, so that would be super helpful. As Antigone mentioned, our work on suicide prevention has spanned nearly a decade at Facebook. And we are constantly working with experts around the world to learn and understand how we can do more to support people in need. For our first panel, I'd like to invite Dr. Barbara Van Halen, who some of us heard last night, on stage to moderate the discussion. We'll have experts from US, from India, from Australia talk to us and tell us what more can technology do. Thank you so much, Barbara, for moderating this.
Did I manage it okay? Okay. Yeah. Good. When I started riffing a little bit, I was like, I kind of remember this
everyone.
and I'm just going to not go look at
better
that
than that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm Barbara Van Dalen. I'm the president and founder of Give an Hour and founder of the Campaign to Change Direction. It's really an honor to be here today with this amazing panel, with all of you, and to have this conversation. And you can see who we all are. So we have different degrees and we have different titles. We're going to be informal in this discussion. And the reason why is because I want to bring this down to us, to all of us, because who we're talking about here, when we talk about these issues and addressing suicide and suicide prevention efforts, we want to make it clear to everybody who's watching and to, frankly, I want to make it clear to all of us in the room that this is about us. We each have a role to play in caring for emotional health and well-being. I'm really excited about the opportunity to work with Facebook to do more to deliver tools to populations in need. That's my passion. So the way that we're going to start is, rather than each of us telling you our long and impressive bios that we all have done, tons of work in this space, I'm going to say again my name, the organization I'm with, and why this matters to me today, why this is important to me today. So I'm Barbara Van Dalen. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm the president and founder of Give an Hour. I'm excited to be here today because I believe that we can deliver tools to communities to ensure their emotional health and well-being in order to prevent suicide. So I'll go with Commissioner Sullivan next.
Well, I'm also excited to be here today to share with you some of what we're doing, but also because it's such a complex problem, and 1,700 individuals in New York State die each year by suicide. So I'm excited to be here to see if we can get that number way, way down.
Dan?
I'm Dr. Dan Reinberg. I'm also a psychologist. I'm the executive director of SAVE, Suicide Awareness Voice of Education. And I'm really excited to be here because I believe that technology provides us the best hope at reducing the global burden of suicide.
Excellent. Joe?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Jo Robinson. I'm a researcher from Melbourne, Australia. And I lead a research group around youth suicide prevention. And I guess I feel really optimistic and excited about being here because certainly in the work that we've been doing over the last few years with young people, I think social media provides a really critical platform actually for them to connect with each other and to seek support and resources and help when they do feel vulnerable or at risk.
Aparna?
Hi, I'm Aparna, and I'm a faculty at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and I'm project director of iCall, which is a technology-assisted national-level psychosocial counseling service. I'm excited to be here because I think we are having some important conversations around issues of suicide and mental health, which are highly stigmatized in my country, but ironically contribute to the maximum number of globally reported suicides in the whole world. So I'm looking at technology as a possible way of reaching to people, giving them power to express themselves and connect them to help.
So that tells you a little bit about our passion, and as you interact with all of us today after this panel, obviously you'll hear ways and find ways to connect, because that is what this is all about. It's amplifying, it's sharing, it's accelerating the work that we're all doing together, because I think we all believe we can get there. We can end suicide. These are preventable deaths. Okay. So now I want to start with a framing question and ask this group of folks, what has been happening over the last 4-6 years that makes us feel hopeful and optimistic, especially with this frame of social media, And then we'll flip it and talk a little bit about some of the things that are concerning to us, and then we'll go into some specific things that each of our panelists are doing, why they're excited about it, what that tells us about the future. And again, it's an invitation for all of us to work together. You're going to hear me say that over and over and over, because I believe we cannot get there alone, any of us. It is about collaboration. It is about coordination. So, Anne, would you like to start in terms of what is making you feel optimistic in terms of what you're seeing broadly right now in our country, in the world, in your own communities, that helps us feel more optimistic that we can prevent those deaths that you're seeing in New York?
I think one of the biggest is the emphasis on working with youth and helping youth really become open about some of the crises they face. We have a very high rate of youth who think about suicide, who attempt suicide in our high schools and even now in our intermediate schools. And I think that working with that group and really, for example, we have mental health education now in New York State, which has been mandated. Those kinds of things mean that we are beginning to push into another generation, quite frankly, a way to think about well-being, health, suicide, depression, isolation, loneliness, hopelessness, all the things that they may be feeling but not willing to talk about. If you learn that in schools, I think then you take that with you for the rest of your life. So I do think that working with the youth, the early prevention is really exciting and going forward and having a real impact for generations to come.
Does that resonate with other folks in terms of this focus on getting the information to youth and other populations? And are there other things that make you excited?
For me, I want to piggyback on that because it is about prevention, and a lot of what you heard Antigone talking about is what is really exciting to me. When Facebook first began their work around suicide prevention, it was around the imminent crisis. Now we're starting to really expand that into the prevention. What can we do upstream? How can we help identify people early on that might be at risk, even before they're at risk of suicide, but identify when an illness might be starting? So really helping early on, and that is, I am really hopeful, going to evolve into mental wellness, some of what you were just talking about. How can we help them learn about those things very early? And
it sounds like, Dan, you believe we're seeing, I do, and it sounds like you see the bubblings of this, that upstream. Okay,
yes.
All right, good. Joe, Aparna, what do you think about what you're seeing that excites you about where we're heading?
I think one of the things that makes me feel quite optimistic is the paradigm shift that I think we've seen over the last few years when it comes to talking openly about suicide. So I think when I started working in suicide prevention, which was a long time ago, we were very nervous as a community to talk openly about suicide for all sorts of reasons, and we did hear Antigone allude to them a little bit earlier around kind of the potential for distress and contagion and those sorts of things. So we were terribly nervous about it. But actually what feels like it's been happening, certainly in Australia, but I think elsewhere in the world, is this paradigm shift where we're starting to talk much more openly in schools. But I think the online setting has provided a really important platform where young people do feel able to have those conversations and connect with other people with similar experiences. So I think for me that really fills me with optimism because, you know, a few years ago young people didn't have anywhere to go, they had nowhere to turn to have these sorts of conversations, whereas now what we've got is a host of platforms that are really working very hard to keep young people safe whilst they do have these kind of connections and conversations online. So I think, you know, for me that's been a really, really positive step.
Exciting step.
Yeah.
Aparna?
So in a country like India, suicide is the leading cause of death among young people, and almost 40% of suicides are committed by people below the age of 30. So I think technology is the way to reach out to people who otherwise feel stigmatized to have conversations around mental health and suicide. And I don't look at the power of technology only vis-a-vis suicide, but I look at it as along the entire continuum of emotional distress. I think having conversations about emotional distress and telling people that it's okay to talk about it and it's okay to seek help, it's not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of strength, I think is the biggest optimism that technology overall and social media in particular provides.
So I think you're already hearing some, we've never met, the five of us, well, Dan and I met once, we did an event together, and obviously I've known of the work, but I think this is very exciting to me that you can hear people coming at this from completely different parts of the world, and we're all seeing some very positive indicators and reason for optimism. So I'm going to share something that I heard on the flip side. something that I heard, actually, I do a podcast called Inner Space, if anyone is interested. It's about these topics. And I was interviewing a young woman who is 18 years old, and she's a singer-songwriter, and she talks very openly about her own struggles and her own challenges. And I asked her, what are you concerned about? What are you worrying about? What troubles you about what you're seeing in the technology and the social media space? And what she shared with me, I've checked out with other folks of her generation and got some confirmation. So I'm going to share, this is concerning to me, and then open it up to see if you have other things or if you've heard this too. So her concern, she said, yes, my generation, meaning hers, 18 to 24-year-olds, are talking more on social media about their emotional states. She said some of that is really authentic and genuine and heartfelt, and people are responding. She said, but what I'm seeing that is concerning is that people are kind of throwing around terms now. I'm so depressed. I'm so anxious. I feel like killing myself. And she said, and it's not really, or maybe it is, but you can't tell. They're not going deeper into really then saying, and so I'm worried about this specifically, or I'd love to have someone share with me how I can deal with this anxiety. And so she said, you then see people reacting almost like, yeah, there she goes again. And that it's discounting the comments. And so her concern was, then will people of her generation sort of shut down and not pay attention to when someone is saying, I'm depressed, and they're really suffering, they're really in need. And so I think, an almost anticipated, we could have anticipated that as we start encouraging people to talk, we have to make sure that we don't, I guess, fall asleep at the wheel and keep reminding them, make sure you're thoughtful and careful about what you say, how you say it, and express the depth more so that people can actually connect in a real way. So that's something that I've been thinking about that concerns me, because I want to keep in front of it. So who has thoughts about things that concern them about what's happening, either technology or elsewhere in the space of trying to prevent and get upstream, as Dan said?
I think there's a couple of things actually, and just sort of thinking about what you were saying is, I think one of the challenges that young people have is that one of the reasons they go online to talk about this sort of content is to get support and to seek, to seek out conversations with other people who are having similar experiences to them. But in doing that, they often also get exposed to distressing type of content that's been posted by other young people. And they don't necessarily always have the skills or feel equipped to be able to respond appropriately. So find themselves in that sort of situation where they're seeing posts that are concerning, and they might be that somebody's expressing that they feel depressed, it might be that somebody's expressing suicidal feelings or what have you, and they don't necessarily have the skills or the confidence to feel able to respond appropriately. So I think that concerns me, and I think there's work to be done in terms of, some of the work we've been doing has really been around upskilling young people and equipping them so that they can respond appropriately when they do get exposed to that type of content. And I think the other thing for me is that young people don't always necessarily know what is helpful and what is unhelpful when it comes to these sorts of conversations, and that it is terribly complex. And with my hand on my heart, I would say that the majority of young people go online to talk about suicide in a way that is helpful and constructive, and generally don't set out to cause harm, but there is the potential for harm to exist. And I don't think we necessarily yet fully understand when something that starts off feeling helpful can become unhelpful. And I guess what I'm thinking about here are the sort of closed groups, self-harm groups that we've heard talked about on Instagram, for example, where young people go in to get that sense of community and talk to other young people who are also engaging in that type of behavior. But then something happens within that group, and whether that's normalization or enabling or something, and young people end up coming away distressed and potentially at elevated risk. And I think we need to better understand that. And
that brings up a really good point. As a child psychologist, we know that kids, and adults too, but kids often, when they don't know what to say, they may say something unkind or insensitive or unintentionally, or sometimes intentionally pushing away. Again, adults do it too. So I think you bring up a really good point about, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the work you're doing around guides and helping young people. Other concerns?
So let me start, because I'm going to feed right into you and some of the work that you talked about that you could share with the group that you're doing throughout the state. I think to me it brings up the idea of collaborations, and it brings up the idea that we all have this role in this. We heard this last night. And we need to be able to have the same conversations, the difficult conversations about suicide, about mental health, mental illnesses, and we need to be able to re-steer and reframe and redirect people when they need to. But the only way to do that is for everybody to step up and take a part in this. If we think that everybody else is going to do it, we are going to, we're going to miss some people. We're going to take our eyes off the road, and it's going to steer in the wrong direction around really the more negative, the more bad that is happening, and we're going to miss those who are really in trouble. But that really takes all of us coming together, and that this is some of the work Anne's doing, and you can talk about bringing people together.
I think it's the important thing here is to get entire communities together to talk about mental health, mental wellness, and sometimes suicide and the things that can lead to that. Communities still have difficulty having this dialogue.
Oh, yes.
And I think it's partly years and years of stigma, years and years of anxiety. And I think even what you said before, sometimes people say, she doesn't mean that, because they really don't want to know if she really means it. There's a sense of wanting to say, I hope she really doesn't mean it, and I'll walk away. But you need to pull communities together. And when we've done that, that seems to be one of the most effective ways to move the needle on helping people not to die by suicide, is to actually get communities involved. So for example, we have a community upstate, a county, Chemung County, that after a series of very tragic deaths in their high schools, brought the whole community together for a period of 10 years, because it doesn't happen in one community meeting or one time getting together. And what they did was a whole host of things, like media. They used lots of media, they used lots of health walks, they did stuff in schools, they trained teachers, they trained firemen, they trained police, they trained everyone to think about mental health and to think about suicide. That community came together. And for 10 years after, they didn't have one high school suicide.
Wow.
And that, I think, have been shown in other pockets, that it's community work that has to come together.
And given that's sort of the way forward, that's a great example where I think that regardless of the kind of community, online communities,
Any community.
Community in a geographic region, community that shares a profession or a university community. So Anne, are there things that are concerning you that are barriers to that kind of work today, the community work? Do you see things that are in the way that we can think about? How can we work together collectively, our community, to make sure, you mentioned collaboration. This may be probably not a big alert or a news bite for anyone, but we in our own field and in our own community don't always work well together, right? Everybody's like, oh, this is great. You guys all must come together and like kumbaya. No, not always. So what can you share about, because I think we need to talk honestly about, the barriers that prevent that community work from happening.
Yeah, I think one of the barriers is still kind of real awareness and buy-in to it being kind of a problem in a real way. It's fascinating. There was one community that did some deep dives into a series of suicides, and they found out that people were dropping off their pets at the local pet store. Pet shelter, for someone to take care of their pets prior to making suicide attempts or completed suicides. And so they then helped train the individuals in the pet shelter to kind of ask the right questions. If I come in and say, I'm dropping off, I can't take care of my cat anymore, or my dog, I'm going to leave it with you, kind of why and what's going on? And they had a significant impact. So it's making it real to people, I think, is part of it. It's like when you said before, she always says that. It's making it real to people, that there are real things that happen, and there are real ways that people act when these things happen. I think there's still a lot of anxiety about facing it. When we first trained physicians to ask people about depression and suicide, they would say to me point blank, you're opening Pandora's box, and I'm not going to know what to do, so I'm not asking. I am not asking. And now we've gotten past that. We've helped them to see that there's a lot you can do. And it doesn't take hours and hours. And that you can refer, you can learn a little bit about someone, you can take the next step. But there's a tremendous, I think, still anxiety. Is in some ways, I think, almost one of the biggest barriers to actually doing this work.
That's a great point. And again, the more we have these conversations, and it's not, it's not a one and done anywhere. No single conversation is going to do it, no single event, but having it over and over, and then you get people who have the light bulb moment. Aparna, what are you concerned about? That you're seeing good things? What worries you?
Yeah, I think for me, more than the concerns, I think it is the use of technology to have conversations, because definitely I think in a country like India, young people are, very complex and multi-layered existences, whereby they are carrying some of the remains of the traditional collectivist culture, but they are also pressing buttons and owning smartphones. So I think they are in a flux of sort of in transition. So I think they definitely require spaces where they can talk about it. But unlike many of the developed countries, suicide and mental illness issues are very, very differently manifested and differently rooted in countries like India, where it is not so much about the person, but it is also about the social context of poverty, unemployment, or violence, which are also contributing to people's emotional distress. And for us, therefore, linking people to resources and offline communities is equally important. And for me, technology is the best tool to get people to talk about it, and also then to link them to appropriate resources, because just talking is not going to help unless some ground level help is also activated for young people. So for me, I think that's a big opportunity that technology offers.
Yeah, well, it sounds like what you're saying is, as we turn these on, because each of these items that we've discussed, each of these issues or challenges, it does have two sides. The positive and then what's missing. And so this is a great opportunity for anyone listening, anyone who can, help think about bringing more technology, making it more available, the right kind of tools, the right kind of access. So Joe, I want to go back because we had talked in the green room about the importance, and you hinted at it, the importance of guidelines, and you spoke about it too. It's helping people understand what to say, what to do. Physicians, that's a great example. We know that physicians, I love physicians, for all of you out there, but their fear of, I don't want to screen for depression because then what do I do? So helping them understand what they can do, helping with the continuum of care, backing it up so pediatricians know it's good to ask these things and how we can get in. And Joe, some work you're doing about guidelines for users online. Can you share a little bit about that so we make sure we get that in before the end of this conversation? Yeah,
for sure. Thank you. So we've been working over the last couple of years with the suicide prevention sector and with young people from across Australia, but the sector from internationally, to develop some guidelines to help young people communicate safely about suicide on social media. So we really took the view, where a lot of the sector was taking the view that social media was bad and we needed to try and shut down these conversations. We really took the view that actually social media provides a really important platform for young people to talk about suicide with each other, but it also provides a bit of a soft entry point, I think, into getting professional help and getting help in their offline worlds as well. So we did this piece of work where we did this kind of suite of consensus activities, actually, with the suicide prevention sector and with young people, to develop a set of evidence-based guidelines that really are designed to empower and equip young people to talk safely about suicide online. So they're kind of structured around the ways young people talk about suicide. There's sections on how to share your own story if you feel suicidal, how to do that in a safe way that's hopefully not going to be triggering for somebody else. There's a section on how to respond to somebody that you might be worried about, but who might have expressed suicidal feelings themselves. And that idea to know that it is okay to reach out to those people and respond. And if you don't feel equipped to, it's okay to link them in to get professional help, including through the platforms themselves. And the sections on how to kind of manage and moderate those sort of memorial groups or closed groups where we know young people are having lots of very sensitive conversations that could be quite difficult So we've been working on those. We've got an Australian version and a US version. We're excited about the prospect of potentially trying to globalize them a little bit, but we're busy bringing them to life at the moment with young people in a suite of kind of campaign content, because as much as I love a set of guidelines, we know that young people aren't going to read a whole 20-page PDF that sits on my website. But we're busy working with young people and a digital media company to really bring them to life through some kind of video-based campaign content. So yeah, it's been very exciting, and they've had fantastic uptake actually. So we're hoping that they'll be really, helpful for young people.
So, and I'm excited because this is, again, because why are we all here? Collaboration, coordination, right? I said I was going to keep bringing this up. I'm like, I want that. I want to push it out through our 700 organizations that partner with Change Direction. So thank you. So we only have about 6-7 minutes left. And I want to bring up something that actually was a very organic conversation that happened yesterday when I was visiting with our Facebook friends. And they said, well, maybe you can talk about this. And I thought it was a great example of, we look to entities like Facebook to help us, all of us, do our work. And thank goodness that they're doing that. And I think sometimes they don't get enough credit for that. And obviously this is an example of why and how they are helping and why it's so important. But I think that there are ways that we can help them too. And here's something that came up. So do you all know, I'm sure you do, about this blue whale attack, the cyber, scary, frightening. For those of you who don't know, this was several years ago. This started somewhere, and it was basically a challenge and an approach to encourage vulnerable young people to take their own lives. And it was frightening. As a child psychologist, I had parents coming in and saying to me, have you heard about this? And we don't know what to do, and we're really scared. And so obviously that's something that Facebook deals with on the platform. But I wonder if we can take just a couple of minutes, if you have any thoughts, it might stimulate ideas. How can communities, how can leaders of communities help Facebook when something like that happens, so that we are actually doing our part to respond in a way that is an effective and a positive response? Dan?
So I can quickly jump in with the Blue Whale Challenge and the Momo Challenge as well. Were two online things that had global impact. We created briefing statements and shared them with Facebook. And what we also did was share them with communities across the world, so that media knew how to report on it safely, to try to minimize the impact on contagion or making the story bigger than it was. We shared it with families and communities and schools and educators and districts around the world, mental health professionals, so they knew how to address it when people came in talking about it. So the idea is if we can hear these ideas that do bubble up, that come up either through media or through young people that are on the platforms or they're gaming, and we can create universal statements that help educate and inform, that Facebook can then push that out very quickly.
Yes, that's a great example. And communities, I mean, if you know about it, and it's almost like, the old version of the siren going off in the community. There's a tornado coming. It is the equivalent of a tornado is coming, right? You can use communities.
And you could use the community. I think having statements like that is helpful, because I think you can go to peers in schools, you can go to teachers, you can go to government, you can go to everyone to use those in their communities and give it a local a tinge, if you want to say, a local statement that can really reach individuals who live there. And whatever the community, think of school communities, college communities, you think of geographic communities, rural area, whatever, that community can get the message out in a way. And often people don't know what to say, you're absolutely right. And if you give them some scripts and some ideas, they then are very glad to do it, very glad to do it.
And you encourage in the community, you tell people, have these conversations with your kids. Don't be afraid. Ask them, have they heard about this? But it takes getting it into that level of the community.
So I think Dan might be being a little bit modest here as well, because he also led a really important piece of work internationally in response to the Netflix season 13 Reasons Why. So ahead of the second season of that, Dan mobilized very quickly an international group of us that pulled together a website that had resources on it for communities and for schools and for young people and for clinicians. And I think that sort of kind of, and what Facebook is brilliant at doing is bringing networks of people together and has the capacity to push information out very quickly. But actually what Dan was able to do there was kind of really mobilize a big group of people from around the world to have all of those resources right at the fingertips, right at the push of a button, where then a platform like Facebook can actually push them out globally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
I don't know what Facebook can do, but I can definitely say what it is currently doing. So I think, for example, iCall is Facebook's trusted partner in India, and whenever anybody talks about suicide, I think there is a direction which is provided, which is constructive for the young people to connect and seek help. And Facebook and iCall had come together to develop some guidelines about how to respond to suicide with different stakeholders, including educationists, parents, media, and loved ones. I think these are the initiatives which will go a long way to talk about.
Well, we're about to end, and first of all, I want to thank you all, not just for the incredible work you're doing, to raise awareness, to change the culture, to create resources, to connect people, to make sure that when there is a crisis in the world, there's a way for people to respond. But really importantly, you all are a great panel. We had a conversation, and many times we don't model very well in our own panels, and thank you all for having a conversation that's, I think, and I hope, informative, inspiring, engaging. That's really, really important for us to demonstrate how we can work together. And so my call to action to this community and to everyone watching, think about how you could plug into one of these efforts, find where your organization works. One thing I want to offer up, our organization is hosting a Week to Change Direction, June 9th through the 15th. You can go to changedirection.org. We're partnering with IBM, we're working with Facebook, and many of you here and many of you watching. Please continue the conversation that we've started today. Join, be part of it. We want to hear your voice. Thank you, and please give the panel a round of applause for this great contribution.
Thank you.
Barbara, thank you so much. We have time for 2 audience questions, if that's
excellent.
okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
we'd love to have questions. I didn't know we got to do questions. I love questions.
Jacqueline.
Please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shay Ronald. I'm at Youthline and from New Zealand. Thank you, Facebook, for bringing us here. New Zealand's got the highest rate of youth suicide in the developed world, over twice that of Australia, and we work every day to support 40,000 young people a year. Many of them are contacting us in crisis, and what we get asked over and over and over again is why? Why? Your thoughts on that from all of your work and experience over many years would be really appreciated.
Well, thank you for the question, and I apologize because I actually should have framed this entire conversation about the complexity. I think that, in many of the organizations that I work with every day that are less sophisticated, it's not that they don't want to understand, they just aren't there yet, they don't have the knowledge, they want the answer. They want to know what it is. And I think that I'll open it up and ask our experts to share some of their perspective about the different factors. But we know that it is the cumulative effect often of many factors, and that there's some good work being done now that's being picked up in our country, in the US, to help identify those risk factors. But obviously, the more we can do on the upside, early education, identification, so that people learn my perspective, so that people can talk and recognize early, oh, this thought I had, Mommy, that's a thought, I don't know if I should, how do I understand that? How do I make sense? Helping that happen early as we can in life, giving people, the children, language that they can use, that's some of the work we're doing, but I'll open it up for other comments.
I think it's an incredibly complex question, and I think that's why it's been so difficult in some ways to move the needle on suicide. But there are internal issues often sometimes with people, the way you feel about yourself. Depression, mental illness certainly is a risk factor. But so are all kinds of societal issues, what you had mentioned before. Economic downturns, people who lose their jobs, people who lose a loved one, people who found that people being evicted from their homes was a big factor in a particular community. So they actually had people, when they were evicted, talk with them, not just about feeling bad about being evicted and suicide and feeling hopeless, but also, what do you do? Where are you going to live? Giving them the resources, something you had mentioned, at the same time to deal with it. So it's incredibly complex. And you always have to dive down, and each individual also has their own particular reasons in another way. So putting all those pieces together, and that's why I keep emphasizing community, because you really have to think about all the things that are going on in your world. And what's going on TV, what's going on politically, what's going on. I've had some people get suicidal over world events where they feel like the world's coming to an end. So the reality is people can react individually, so you have to think about their whole world and the world you're living in, and what stresses, economic stresses are one of the biggest risk factors all the time. But, and also mental illness in terms of depression, anxiety, those kinds of illnesses, also major risk factors. But it's very complex, very complicated.
And I would just add to that, when suicide becomes an option for someone, either they've heard about it, they see it, they might hear some of those messages that they find online that are not helpful. When it becomes an option and they're already distressed and they're already hopeful, that becomes really problematic for people.
And I would just add that in the military and veteran space, we do a ton of work. That's how I began Give an Hour 15 years ago. The access to firearms for someone who is, and this isn't a statement about guns. My father was a hunter and my brothers. It's about access to firearms when someone is in a very dangerous state is another one of those factors.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I would say that for a country like India, it is actually an interplay between personal, interpersonal, but largely social determinants. We have phenomena like farmer suicide, which is so peculiar to India, and amongst young people, especially if you look at young women, violence, gender-based discrimination is one of the most important determinants. And it's interesting, in a country like India, marriage acts as a cover for men, but definitely it's one of the determinants of a poor emotional health amongst women. So a lot of these stressors are interpersonal and definitely societal also. That's why I talked about the larger environment and the development also that needs to be highlighted.
I know a lot of, we have a lot more questions, but we are also out of time. So should we just end with the last answer and then?
Okay.
Yes, sorry
so
about
Joe,
that.
This is hopefully a
I get the
good
last word.
Yeah, I get the last word, and we can obviously continue the conversations beyond.
So I get asked that question all the time as well. Why are we seeing these rising rates of suicide? And we've got similar patterns in Australia than you're seeing in New Zealand, including actually very concerning increases in suicides amongst young females. That's where we're seeing our biggest rises actually in terms of suicide rates across the population. And the other comment that I get, or question I get asked a lot, is it social media? Is it the rise in social media? And my sort of stock answer, I think, really is it is complex, as you've heard everybody sort of say today. It's never the result of one simple factor. It's kind of usually accumulation of multiple factors, and some of those are kind of those very underlying distal risk factors like mental ill health, suicide-related behaviour in a family member, and so on. And some of them will be those more proximal life event type risk factors, so exposure to suicide-related behaviour in a friend or a peer, adverse life events like conflict and all of those sorts of things. And they tend to act very cumulatively to increase people's level of risk. I think just the other thing to say really quickly is that the other thing that we're seeing increases on in Australia and New Zealand, I think, are things like rises in rates of self-harm, rises in rates of depression, anxiety, hospital presentations. And whilst I think all of those risk factors are complicated and it's difficult to untangle what's really going on, for me, the solution actually is relatively simple. And I think, if we can respond to people when they need help, and many of these young people, and certainly young females, seek help all the time. They talk about their feelings. If we can respond to people and give them the help they need in the format that they need it, whether that's kind of in a crisis line or in a mental health service or from their friends and peers, actually will reduce suicide rates.
And the last thing that I'll say that we didn't talk much about, but is another complicated factor, is substance use disorders. Again, as both a risk factor, and if someone becomes addicted, then that affects their mental health and their judgment, their impulsivity, and their overall well-being. So a complicated topic, but so much to be hopeful and optimistic about. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you again to the panel.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, all the panelists. Suzanne wants to just add a
Yes,
comment.
hello everyone. It was the blue whale was mentioned by the panel, and oh, well, hello. The game or the challenge, the blue whale, was mentioned by the panel. However, according to many in-depth reports, including by the BBC, it seems that